This is a slight addendum, or a small addendum. There are aspects to this false dilemma which I want to sort of elaborate and to explore further. So the leveraging of this sort of structural false dilemma uh, has other sort of manifestations around it, which I tried to sort of explore to some extent when I was talking about what is generally considered the liberal, kind of mentality, almost like a kind of psychological temperament that has this sort of that sort of has these definite sort of benefits of membership, of being able to sort of leverage the narrative in order to kind of engineer satisfaction to one's covert expectations and sort of subjective purview of one's, what one is entitled to according to this model, this idealized, abstracted, disembodied sort of introjective, almost projection, which you sort of you which there is this procedure of facilitating people into being incepted by, that essentially, that all you have to do is slander them as being phobic, and then you've already got them modeled within your categorization system and sort of ideological narration of reality, in a kind of the specious reality tunnel, in which if other people want to escape the expectations and predictions that you can generate from this model, they have to prove a negative. They have to prove that they're not phobic before you even, and you don't have to deign to deal with their positive reasoning. Um, so this kind of dismissive insulation of the sort of the dogmatic worldview, um, the only sort of conditions that are required in order to maintain this kind of instrument, or this kind of social corruption of, because it is a kind of, it must be a sort of a social fact for it to have these powers, for it to be perpetrated against people. It has to have a kind of a certain requisite sort of social normativity. It has to sort of be a social fact that it is seen as a kind of, as the fashionable, in vogue, kind of cultural hegemon. Um, it has to be regarded as publicly making a declaration to its kind of its moral supremacy. And even if it's controversial, like, that's enough. That's enough for them to just basically claim the moral high ground and to claim their own opinions as the kind of, as the default, as the kind of. But another sort of manifestation of this is essentially, and this really has to do with the kind of the reality tunnel which its adherents and its proponents can sort of just deploy against people at will, is essentially the power of the kind of the cherry-picked dishonesty, or rather the selective honesty, and the general sort of intellectual dishonesty that can be perpetrated, that you can sort of, that you can be very um, obsessed and particular about certain technical abstract generalizations that are, like, technically, according to some, kind of really strange technicality, are, can be framed as being true. You can basically, you can play word games um, ad nauseum. You have this kind of this absolute freedom to sort of to toy with the language, to create, kind of I mean, this is a form of dishonesty because, it's usually hinged on essentially kind of exploiting these weird sorts of fallacies of equivocation, where you've got a word that has multiple meanings, and then you sort of you use the same word, but you are relying on different definitions in the same use of the word, and so you're kind of using that to kind of round the edges of your, you know, embarrassingly convoluted and, nonsensical sort of worldview. Uh, um, and these are the kinds of ingredients that are used effectively to sort of canonize a sort of a false dilemma that is usually not, it's not spoken, but it's almost emotionally understood as essentially as the mechanism through which progress can be excised and extracted from the ideological scapegoat, that essentially only by putting pressure on the 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 sort of the alternative interpretation can we force a kind of uh, uh, progressive movement by the distinctive contrasting, self-righteousness in the other interpretation of the dilemma, because the dilemma is basically good and evil, becomes the stand-in of good and evil, and that becomes essentially the filter through which um this is the strangest thing, is that they have a kind of, the false dilemma is really a kind of a theory of good and evil, but it's such nonsense, and it's such, it's so fabricated, it's so ideologically, sort of trumped up, that it doesn't also offer a real independent definition of good. Good is only derived by its essentially opposition to the evil sort of interpretation that makes the evil aspect in the false dilemma, that they are hinged to maneuvering via. So and and this is really the addiction in borderline personality disorder. I mean, this is how they can sort of stay embedded within their very simplistic tactics, is that essentially without the comfort and the convenience of the kind of the seesaw motion of essentially first delineating a kind of uh, is they are, I've called this, like an alloplastic strategy, sorry, a strategy of alloplasticity, to try to debunk the concept that they are sort of prone to this kind of involuntary, dependence on an alloplastic defense. It's not an alloplastic defense. They are they are instinctually, in some sense, in a very visceral, emotional way, in a very prominent, emotional centric, they're using their subjective sensibility to craft uh, manipulation of both the narrative um, in order to leverage a kind of unitary narrative and to dictate um, responses and actions relative to that narrative. And they can only do that by essentially assuming this kind of canonical inculcation of good and evil, which they can sort of game the outcome of, or they can game the logical conclusion flowing from that narrative, proceeding from the basis of that narrative. They can strategically predict what the outcome will be, because all they have to do is essentially frame what they are defining as evil and then convolute it into a false dilemma, and then not mention the false dilemma directly, but sort of indirectly leverage it by their subjective and innocent and naive, sort of participation in that unitary narrative. And so it's sort of all the manipulation is taking place on the level of the premises that the narrative is based in, is premised in. Um, and as long as they can stop people from diffusing the false dilemma, they can effectively just keep on propounding a kind of that table, sort of table thumping, that it needs to be solved by someone, that someone needs to sort of um, uh, uh, that someone needs to resolve the obstacle of the dilemma by essentially just um, I mean, the weird thing is that, it's sort of, they're sort of taking people hostage with the narrative, and they don't even want necessarily the narrative to be honored, in that the narrative doesn't have to be believed. It's like it is an ideological fiction that is basically, they just want the recipe to be fulfilled. They want someone to essentially virtually cater to the narrative. They don't have to believe the narrative. They don't have to like actually incept themselves into the to the extent that they actually believe it. And in fact, to actually fulfill the narrative or to pander to it, one actually has to know that it's fallacious, to know that it actually is just a kind of that it's a nebulous, vague reduction that is very inexact. But it's like, the point of almost extolling the narrative and leveraging it is just that, uh, to compel someone else essentially to absorb accountability for it. Essentially, it's the whole thing is a kind of is an external locus of sort of abrogated responsibility, of sort of diluting and diffusing responsibility into somebody else having to adopt it into a kind. I mean, this is where in borderline it's often described that, that the codependency has this parentification aspect to it. I don't think it's really about the target being a parent. I think it's more about the self conception of the borderline as basically, and I mean, as basically being a sort of a greedy parasite, and that they are going to, and they've sort of already decided that they are going to use this maneuver, they're going to use this strategy to interface with reality, so that they don't have to ever burden themselves with being responsible for their own outcomes, that they can always sort of divert responsibility onto an external locus of blame. They can always just scapegoat, and then they can always cast themselves off as innocent and naive, so that if that person can't be extracted from, then the story can be doubled down on and just passed on to the next white knight or something like that. That you can just find a new person to be duped into the drama. Um, so it's kind of it's got this thing where even if it fails, it can just try again later. It can sort of just take that descriptive mass and make a larger story to leverage on the next target. But and so in that sense, hypothetically, strategically, their powder is always dry. That it's always, it's never defeated. It's just, looking to, it just has to strike it lucky once in some sense. It just has to find one dupe. So it has a very high standard for what it's willing to sort of settle for. And so as long as it sort of preserves its strategy and preserves its standard for what it wants to be delivered, or how it wants to be pandered to and catered to, then it just has to keep on using the same sort of kind of narrative manipulation and inception of someone. But so, I mean, generally, I conceive of these sorts of people as being sort of greedy trust parasites, because essentially what they are doing when they are engaging in this kind of ideological sort of reality tunnel and self, it can get quite, the level of psychosis around maintaining this kind of strategy is extreme, because in order to preserve the idea that they are doing this innocently, that they are kind of this involuntary, that this is just happening around them, and that they can't help but just sort of describe the narrative in the way that it appears to them, is essentially their defense from having to ever find an alternative to the strategy, um, of interfacing with reality in any way in which they actually accrue any individual responsibility for their own outcomes. And essentially, so this whole function essentially allows them to collectivize trust. They don't have to worry about trust as long as they can sort of play word games with people and extract a certain level of compliance, and so that they can abuse people by essentially abusing the concept of trust itself, because trust doesn't mean anything. So as long as they can extract certain words and certain impressions that they can use in their narrative broadcast of what happened, as long as they can say, no, this is the sequence of events, they don't have to be responsible for the fact that they cultivated essentially an irresponsible and toxic, and because they can just say, no, I was naive, I was duped, I was it was the other person's actions, and so they often gravitate towards people also with character deficits and weaknesses, because the messier and more convoluted the involvement and the entanglement, sort of the more the other person is going to be prone into falling into the pit of their narrative and into their sort of manipulative word games, the less that they'll be able to sort of, so they try to create very overly sort of complex things, because the more complicated things become, the more it's easy to just rely on their simplistic narrative reduction and the theme underlying it, which is basically the false dilemma, which means that essentially you will have to sort of supply to them the fulfillment of their recipe as to what they are supposedly fearful of, or what they define as evil. You have to kind of virtually concede to them their subjective feeling about what is evil, and you have to manage it for them, essentially. And so it's this kind of, and so the answer to the narrative essentially is this kind of perpetual infantilism of their subjective stream of consciousness, that if you try to dismantle or try to name the false dilemma that's sort of that's grounding it, or that's underlying it in terms of its structure, then essentially they just throw all their toys out the cot and they have a tantrum, and they try to sort of increase the cost of challenging their subjective unitary extolling of the narrative, so that they can be essentially, so they can always be the center of the narrative, the center of the universe that they can just describe into being real. And so it doesn't matter if it's real or not, it just matters that they feel that it's real, or that they report that their feelings are invested into this. And this simply becomes because they are more invested into their feelings of, which are premised in this kind of self-entitlement and sort of this convenient strategic edge which they can extract from just relaying their stream of consciousness and their stream of feelings, that never have to get into the dynamics of actually forging trust or maintaining trust or tracking what they are doing to the concept of trust. So they are effectively, the premise is essentially that they are fundamentally innocent and victims, and other people are fundamentally perpetrators and dishonest and don't have integrity. And so because they have no integrity for upholding any kind of modicum of trust in a scenario, they can just, instead of having to cultivate trust and develop it and maintain it, and sort of keep their trust in a good stead with any situation or relationship, they can instead abuse trust into essentially being a hypothetical expectation of essentially the best of all possible outcomes. So essentially they can just extract semantics, hollow semantics. They can play hollow word games, and they can just keep on reporting the narrative, and they can say, well, look, I reported the narrative at that point, and then you said that, which gave me the impression that you meant this. And trust doesn't matter. It just matters what their unilateral interpretation of the narrative is, which is always hinged on basically them being able to extract the best possible, sort of hypothetical uh, 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 sort of entitlement, which is fundamentally tethered to uh, their so-called definition of evil, um, which their narrative is somewhat premised in. And so it's a very complicated strategy. It's a very complicated web of relating to other people. In some sense, they're not relating to other people. Other people are just pawns in this strategy. They're just pieces. Um, and if they don't sort of play along to the tune of the borderline or the ideologue, then they're sort of their fair game. And as this manifests in the more ideological sense, the fair game manifests as this very specious selective honesty, and the general sort of leveraging of a general sort of intellectual dishonesty. Um, and you can see this, when someone is making ground and talking about them, how they will basically jettison what is being spoken about, how they will convolute it, how they will, I mean, not every individual, but many of them essentially, because they know how the ideology works. They know the fundamental formula of how the ideology works. And so they can you can tell when they're just trying to escalate issues in order to effectively resort to the reductive, nebulous generalization that allows them to sort of to make their blanket accusations and general aspersions against people, and sort of project the roles that are required in order to maintain their very privileged ideological position in this, in this puzzle, um, which has essentially no resolution. It's a never-ending sort of chain of being able to. It's interesting. It does have a sort of ancillary sort of kicker. It has an ancillary sort of it has an ancillary argument that it uses, which is basically envy. That is, well, if other people have been able to achieve something that simulates, or that roughly approximates what they are trying to obtain via the strategy, then it should just be ceded to them. It should just be granted them. It should just be bestowed upon them automatically. Why are we even arguing about this? This strategy should be good enough. And essentially, the evidence is essentially this weird kind of envy generalization. Uh, but that isn't the main thrust of the argument. That's the level of evidence that they sort of provide as to the kind of the structural validity of their sort of formulaic extraction, um, which is not dealing in positive reasoning, but is this weird kind of inductive argument. It's this weird sort of and where they're making these egregious sort of intellectual, nonsensical, sort of things about, basically trying to extract an ought from an is, and they're doing silly strange things like that. Um, and therefore they can sort of bypass actually having to construct anything authentically, which um, trust is a very important thing. But you basically, that's another way of understanding their modus operandi, is essentially they are living in a worldview in which there is no such thing as trust. Trust as a faculty of the human mind is just basically, it is um, banished. It is reduced into it is the medium that the narrative requires, just to sort of it is the fabric itself of the ideological narrative that they use. And so without essentially converting trust into the canvas upon which they can sort of have their radical fascistic imagination and their weird sort of extraction, their ideological, sort of redistribution in their mind, that they can sort of, in an abstract way, they can just kind of do these weird sorts of generalized horse trading, that they can just sort of imagine these strange counterfactual historical things, and they don't have to understand how reality works. They don't have to understand how anything functions in reality, because they can just play this abstract horse trading in their mind between these generalizations and these fascistic categories that they interpret reality through. This is the kind of the worldview that is entrenched in that kind of intellectual dishonesty. But it's and this is why I say that it's greedy, is because it won't give up, or at least borderlines themselves, natural borderlines, will not relinquish that easy power. That oversimplification is very hard once people have essentially been acclimatized, have been ideologically captured. I think you might be able to get to a point at which that you can make them dormant. And in some sense, I don't think any more than 20% of the population can actually be full blown fascistic in this worldview. I don't think you can get more than 20% of the population to actually be this kind of hybridized borderline ideologue. But 20% is more than enough. 20% of people who believe in something uh, uh, so concretely is enough conformity, is enough of a critical mass that you can very easily take over society, because they have enough belief for everyone else. So as long as the cultural fabric is permissive enough into respecting this ideology, when you've got 20% of the population, I mean, it's more than enough. I mean, you never have that level of conformity in anything. Like every every institution, every organization is basically a heterogeneous, kind of as a kind of a heterodox mix of many different temperaments. And so when you're dealing with a society in which 20% of the population has been radicalized and acclimatized to essentially borderline relating uh, uh, to society or reality in general, or to you've got a toxic psychological politics that maybe can be recovered, in that you can sort of create a new cultural hegemon that suppresses the borderline ideology, and then it'll just kind of go dormant. But their morality will never actually fix itself, sadly. I mean, these people will sit there quietly, sort of, as a kind of, as a cancer, basically. I mean, they are a social toxin. They are poisonous. And they, I mean, and certain, I mean, this is why certain subcultures are so toxic and poisonous. Why certain cultures get to a state at which, they cannot help themselves, essentially. Um, I mean, I'm talking about situations in which you live in a relatively free society, and essentially your culture is literally stopping you from taking any progressive steps in terms of developing uh, uh, a transformed and a basis of the culture is literally creating perverse incentives for you to make progressive steps in improving your situation, because then you're losing your ability essentially to be able to reflexively blame generalizations. You're losing your ideological um, exteriorization of blame onto an ideological scapegoat, and you're losing your claim against the system and against being able to sort of collectivize trust at your convenience. And so, like, there's quite a substantial shift between moving from the mode of being able to actually, I'm responsible for maintaining my own trust, my own cognizance and evaluation on how to cultivate trust and navigate the life that I lead via tracking who I trust and who I don't trust and why I trust them, and being trustful of a situation, and being accountable for the outcome based on how well I am at judging uh, um, and evaluating if I should have trusted that person or not. Um, and because trust also has deeper, because you can trust someone with all the best reasons, but there was a lack of knowledge, there was a lack of understanding of how the world works. And then so trust is also linked to competence, it's linked to practical knowledge, it's linked to developing a sense of and a sensibility of pragmatism. All of that is what can be completely essentially diverted into, well, somebody else should infantilize me, somebody else should just do it all for me and deliver to me what I deserve based on this predictive generalization, sort of abrogation and collectivization of trust. And so, when you've got cultures that entrench essentially the dissolution of trust, you have essentially a toxic culture. Um, Many people, even individuals that are born into such cultures, escape from them, and very they profess to even describe what's toxic about those cultures, and they can be actually quite articulate about, no, I know how I escaped that situation is because I rebelled against the consciousness that I was being essentially inculcated into, and I regarded it as being toxic, and I discerned it as an individual. I was a discerning individual, and I overcame it. And so they have a distilled, definitive, sort of delineated solution to some of these problems. I mean, just because you have the psychological solution doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that your life suddenly becomes easy. It just becomes capable of being processed. It becomes capable. You become capable of tracking your own um, plan of progress. You become and you inculcate or you develop a sense of responsibility, which grows in its powers to deal and confront and to move forward. And that's basically the pattern of self-empowerment, as it were. I mean, obviously, self-empowerment can be hugely facilitated, and if you live in generally a free society, if you live in a society in which there is less thoughtless or reckless, unintelligent, retributivistic, generalization. I mean, if there's more free energy in motion, then there are more opportunities for someone who has their eyes open to engage, um, and form, essentially, because it's one thing to know how to trust. It's another thing to actually, um, you know, just because you know how to trust, you might know how to trust, but it's also how many opportunities are there to actually be able to trust anyone, because everyone might just be so beaten down by a tyrannical system, or by or by conditions, which so I mean, there might be fewer opportunities, and obviously the more opportunities to trust, but also with the right mind frame, the right sort of mindscape of opportunity, which sort of necessitates this ability to be able to gauge trust and to act within the kind of a trust economy, as it were, as a kind of a trust psychological economy. But this ideology makes the trust economy nothing. It makes it neutered. It makes it, you can't even, because no one has a trust account. There's just this kind of collectivized trust that's ideologically ascribed to people. And that predictive machine essentially is what hollows out reality. It hollows out human interaction, and it makes people sort of autistic, insulated. I mean, there's a deep level of solipsism. I mean, perhaps it's that's sort of bound up within borderline personality disorder, in how essentially in their abuse of trust and exploitation of the concept of trust, in their manipulation of the narrative and of word games and of other people, that basically means that they will never be able to do anything other than essentially be this kind of greedy trust parasite. That is what that's all you can almost trust them to be, sadly. And it is a self-satisfying sort of arrangement, because once you've given yourself over to those tactics, it's very hard to rehabilitate. I mean, maybe the hybridized ideological variant, depending on how deep you went, it might be possible to rehabilitate. But in some sense, it's too easy and convenient a mechanism not to just invoke whenever anything is a bit tough. Instead of saying, oh no, I blame myself because I've mistrusted or I've distrusted incorrectly, or I didn't understand reality, or I didn't, I wasn't navigating, and now I hold myself responsible for not navigating the situation better so that I can actually learn from it. It's much easier just to have a tantrum and to invoke essentially this external locus of blame. So, you can't hold people to common standards. There's no such thing as common standards within the borderline, because all standards come from themselves, which makes it even, and they also distort reality. They distort culture and society to such an extent to which the notion of standards they just go out the window. They're only double standards. They're only these weird, ideologically enshrined, sort of special dispensations that are precipitated. And so they completely they destabilize the functioning of any free society. They destabilize, as they destabilize trust, they destabilize liberal values. They hollow things out, until everything just becomes a kind of pedant, sort of catering force that will deliver and satisfy their covert self-entitlement and expectations, which are discreetly woven into their description of the narrative, and so that they can just or they can always count on an audience to their description of the narrative. This is why there is this, listen to the story, listen to the story, listen to the story. I mean, they have basically delineated the ideological translation of borderline personality disorder, of needing a codependent audience to absorb your unilateral dictation of the narrative, a kind of automatic inception to force people to psychologically penetrate other people's emotional boundaries and their reality, and be able to just kind of foist the false dilemma that other people must be susceptible and vulnerable to having the false dilemma leveraged against them. Okay, well, that's a pretty good description, I think, of these issues.